Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time it might be that you are watching this. I'm glad that you've tuned in to Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School. I hope that this time will continue to be a blessing to you as we do our flyover of every book of the Bible. Remember that last week we looked at the Thessalonian epistles, and now we are coming up to the latter part of the epistles that Paul wrote, and these are called the pastoral epistles. That's 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. They're called the pastoral epistles because they are instructions by the Apostle Paul to pastors. Timothy was a young friend of Paul, and so Paul wrote this book to try to help him in his church. It's as if Paul realized that he was not going to be there to sort of mentor Timothy or Titus, and as a result of that, he wrote this book so that they would know what they should do under certain circumstances in the church. And the books are valuable still for that, of course, still in helping us to realize what's going on. So we have reached the last three of Paul's letters. And Paul's letters are divided up just as the New Testament is divided up. Remember that the New Testament is divided up into the Gospels, the Acts, the letters of Paul, the Catholic epistles, and we call them the Catholic epistles because they're not written to any particular church. They're written sort of to the universal church. The word Catholic means universal. That's the reason in the Apostles' Creed that we say we believe in one holy Catholic church. It's not the Roman Catholic Church. It's the one holy universal church. And within the letters of Paul, there are certain divisions. We've looked at the letters about salvation, sometimes called the Soteriological Letters. These are Romans and Galatians and 1 and 2 Corinthians. We've looked at the letters from prison, sometimes called the prison epistles. And these are Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And now, last week, we looked at the letters about the future, called the eschatological epistles. Eschatos means last in Greek, and so these are the letters about the last things, 1 and 2 Thessalonians. And now we've come to the last of Paul's epistles. Unless you want to believe that Paul wrote Hebrews, we'll talk about different ideas about who wrote Hebrews when we get to it. But for now, we're looking to the pastoral epistles, which are 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. This is the first of the pastoral epistles, and one that has a lot of really, really interesting and valuable information for all of us as we read it. Here's our inevitable cartoon. There is a tie moth. So you remember that the tie moth stands for Timothy. There's only one tie moth in this case, and he is leading other people. How is he leading them? He's leading them by looking at a manual on how to lead them. And that's what 1 Timothy is. It's a manual for how to lead the church in the proper way. And so let's look at this manual together and look at what Paul has to say to us in terms of understanding how the church ought to operate. In the time in Paul's life, and again, in a second we'll get to the authorship questions of 1 Timothy, but I believe that Paul wrote 1 Timothy, and we'll talk about why that's a controversy in a moment. But in the time in Paul's life, this was a very difficult time. He had a variety of issues. He had started a number of churches. Those churches had multiplied. This is toward the end of his life. Those churches had multiplied, and they had been increasingly attacked by false teachers. And they had suffered from defections, people leaving. And some of those churches were near a state of collapse. And so Paul can't address a letter to each member of the congregation that's having a problem. He can't send a colleague to explain it as he had done in some other churches. Instead, he sends these pastoral letters, these manuals of tradition and commentary to the co-workers who will in turn convey the apostles' mentorship and instructions to the rest of the members of the church. And the letter of 1 Timothy is just such a set of instructions. Now, one of the great problems that you will find as you read about 1 Timothy in academic literature is that there's a huge controversy about who wrote the book. There's a lot of debate today about who wrote the pastorals and in what order. Some will argue that Titus was written first. Some will argue that 2 Timothy was written before Titus. I hold a traditional position about authorship. I believe that Paul wrote the book. But some evangelicals, not me, nobody at Knox, but some evangelicals have argued that this was written by a student of Paul to preserve Paul's thoughts on church leadership. And this gets into a sort of problem because the book claims to be written by Paul. Would it have been unfair or unjust or would it have been untruthful to say that the book was written by Paul if it were just someone else taking Paul's notes and writing them down? That's the question that evangelicals have to wrestle with. Another sort of issue is that those who are outside of the evangelical camp will simply say, Paul didn't write these letters. There's no way that he could have written these letters. And the essence of the argument is that the church in the pastoral epistles is very well developed. The church has leaders. The church has problems, the problems that have come about after years of being in existence. And so they argue this letter was written to church problems that couldn't have existed during Paul's lifetime. I find that argument particularly problematic in that, first of all, Paul started many of these churches, and as a result of that, he could have set up the church government then as he was dealing with it. So I don't think that argument has a great deal of merit. I hold to the fact that Paul wrote the epistles. I'm in the minority, the vast minority of New Testament scholars. You should realize that probably upwards of 90% of New Testament scholars today would argue that Paul didn't write the pastoral epistles, or at least didn't write all of them. I think that's mistaken, but you can do some research on that if you would like to. There are two good commentaries that I would like to recommend if you want to go deeper on this issue. One of them is by Mounce. It's in the Word Biblical Commentary series. It's a big, thick book on the pastoral epistles, much thicker than the epistles themselves. And if you're really interested, you can read a 600-700-page book on the pastoral epistles. On the other hand, there's a book written by my early Greek teacher, Dr. George Knight. And it's a wonderful commentary on the epistles, and you can just look up George W. Knight and see his work on the pastorals if you would like to do more work there, because he spends a good deal of time, Dr. Knight does, a good deal of time working through why we know for certain that Paul wrote the epistles, or why the arguments against Pauline authorship are not they're not nearly as strong as they might at first appear. So I believe that Paul wrote the epistles. That's where I am. You may be in a different place. That's up to you. In terms of the date, of course, depends on who you think wrote the book. If Paul wrote the book and he died in about 65 AD, somewhere around there, if Paul wrote it, then the book obviously had to be written before he died. We don't believe in some sort of channeling writing or anything like that. So that puts the book pretty early. On the other hand, there are others who say that the problems that these books deal with, the need for the manual in these books, is late probably 90, some would say even after 100 AD. I don't find that compelling. Again, those two books will help you with that. In terms of the outline of the book of 1 Timothy, it can be divided into a few very interesting and very practical divisions. The first is the church and its message. In verse 1, Paul is telling Timothy, this is the message that you should have. And in chapter 1, the whole first chapter is dealing with that. He deals with teaching and sound doctrine. Obviously, the church needs to be a church of sound doctrine. Unsound doctrine has a way of creeping in. The book of Jude talks about people who crept in unaware. And unsound doctrine has a way of creeping in unaware, and then it gets bigger and bigger. Paul is saying you can't do that, Timothy. Then there's preaching a glorious gospel. Paul is saying to Timothy, it's a wonderful, wonderful calling to preach the gospel. And then the latter part of chapter 1 has to do with defending the faith. How is it that we defend the faith against those who want to attack it or those who want to ignore it? Paul has some very good advice there for us. That's the first chapter. The second and the third chapters have to do with the church and its members. So Paul doesn't just have things to say to Timothy, the leader of the church. He also has things to say to the members of the church, those who are there listening. He says that these are the kind of people that ought to be in a good Christian church. First, there ought to be praying men. And he says to them, these are the kind of men that we need in the church, men who are lifting up the name of Christ, men who are praying that the Lord will bless the church, will bless its members, will bring in new converts. Then he talks about modest women. This is a very interesting passage, and if we had time, if I were teaching a whole class on the pastoral epistles, we would spend a lot of time dealing with why does Paul talk about this kind of modesty, what was going on in the ancient world. And the essence is that there were certain ways that women dress that sort of advertised them as women of negotiable affections, if you will, women who could be bought for a price. And Paul says, don't dress like that. And then he says, in addition to praying men and modest women, we need dedicated officers. That is, officers of the church who are not necessarily the pastor, but they are officers of the church who are working hard to make sure that the church runs well, runs smoothly, and all of those sorts of things like that. And finally, Paul wants to make sure that there are behaving believers. There are certain things that believers ought not to do. We call this in theology sanctification. So we grow, just as we grow in the faith, we also grow in our sanctification. Sanctification is not just an act of God. It is an act of the person as a result of what God has done for him or her, and with the help of God, becoming more and more sanctified and doing more and more of what the text tells us to do. None of us are perfect, obviously. But we ought to be growing closer to God as we go along. If our lives now are exactly the same as they were when we became a Christian, something has gone wrong with the sanctification process. And so we ought to ask ourselves, are we becoming more and more like Christ? The third part of the book has to do with the church and its minister, because Paul wants to make sure that those there who are ministering the word, whether they be Timothy or someone else who's reading the letter, that they pay special attention. And so he tells us in chapter 4 that we ought to have a good minister, a minister who cares about his people. that we ought to have a godly minister, a minister whom people realize does indeed love the Lord. He exhibits humility. He exhibits the kind of character that people see as godly. And he's a growing minister. I teach a lot of students in the seminary, obviously. And when they ask me, how do you keep yourself from just becoming burned out in the ministry? Or how do you keep yourself from just doing things every day because that's what you're supposed to do? And one of the things that I tell them is that I've never met a minister who was moving forward in the faith who was not reading regularly, both reading the text and reading other things regularly, helping them to grow in their knowledge and to see the wonderful world that God has given us. And finally, in the last 2 chapters of the book, there is the church and its ministry. To whom does the church minister? It ministers to older saints. It ministers to widows who, in this period in history, really didn't have much of a way of taking care of themselves. If their husband hadn't left them anything, and often there just wasn't anything to leave, remember that there was no middle class during this period, in Israel at least. There was mostly lower class and a few people who were upper class, but no middle class. So if you were lower class, lower economic class, I mean by that, and your husband died, you essentially had to try to find a job, which was very difficult for a woman in those days. You had to try to get money from one way or another, or get your family to take care of you. It was a difficult time. And so Paul says to us, the church should wrap its arms around those widows and help them, widows and orphans who can't take care of themselves. The church should also minister to the church leaders. We shouldn't forget that even church leaders need to be ministered to. They need to be built up. They need to be taught. And so you, whatever church it is that you might be attending, or you ought to be especially insistent that your church leaders are continuing to grow and are continuing to be ministered to. That might be by going away for a week for a study retreat. It might be from one thing or another. But whatever it is, the church leaders need to be ministered to as well. To servants, that is, to slaves. There were a number of slaves in the particular area at this time, and as a result of that, it was necessary that these slaves be ministered to. You might ask, why is it that Paul didn't just say, get rid of all your slaves? And there are a variety of reasons for that we talked about when we looked at the book of Philemon. But the essence is that slavery in the New Testament was a very different kind of slavery than slavery in the United States. Slavery in the New Testament was not racially based. It generally wasn't, you didn't become a slave sometimes you did, but much of the time you didn't become a slave by being stolen from your homeland. And so Paul says that slaves ought to be obedient and ought to do the best that they can to show Christ to their masters. Then, of course, there ought to be a ministry to troublemakers. They exist in every kind of church. There's no church that doesn't have a troublemaker or 2 or 5. I remember my father, who was a Baptist minister, saying an old time-worn phrase: if you ever find the perfect church, whatever you do, don't join it, because that will ruin the place. And that reminds us that all of us are troublemakers in one way or another, but hopefully through our sanctification, we become less and less troublemakers. And then there ought to be ministry to the rich. There were rich people during this time, and many of them gave a lot to try to help Christianity and the church that Paul had started. And so there ought to be ministry to them. The book of James, when we get to that, will tell us clearly that there's a particular way that rich people ought to be treated, and that is that they ought not to be given special privileges. James is death on giving rich people special privileges. When we get to the book of James, you'll see how starkly he argues against that kind of activity. And Paul says that we ought to minister to the educated, those who have been to school, those who have studied. Now, not everybody was able to go to school or allowed to go to school, but there were those who were well educated, particularly in Ephesus at this time. They may have been educated in philosophy. And so Paul says you want to be able to minister to those people and to answer those people's questions as well. Quickly, what are the important themes in the book of 1 Timothy? Well, first of all, there's the theme of church structure. How is the church to be structured? And by that I mean there are basically three kinds of structure in any church, in the church at large. There's congregational structure. That's basically the Baptist and the non-denominational church. In that case, the congregation votes, and that's what they do. And any member of the congregation has the same amount of power to vote as any other member of the congregation. That's congregationalism. On the other hand, there is leadership from the top down. In that case, you have one person making decisions for the whole church. This would be, an example would be the Roman Catholic Church, where the Pope makes decisions and passes them down to the church. In the middle of that is the church that is ruled by a group of people. That's the Presbyterian Church. In the Presbyterian Church, most of the decisions are not made by congregational vote. Most of the decisions are made by what we call the session. And the session is made up of the elders of the church. The elders are those who have shown themselves to be spiritually mature and wise. And so they are the ones who help make the decisions for the church. The reason is that a person who has been in the church for 25 years and who has studied the Scripture carefully all of that time and has been mentored all of that time is probably going to be a better person to vote for or against something than a person who just came to faith and joined the church last week. And so the power is put into the hands of those who are spiritually mature. And that's not every decision in the Presbyterian Church, but it's many of the decisions. The elders are elected by the congregation. The session of elders then makes many of the decisions. If a member of the congregation feels that the elders are making the wrong decision, he or she has the right to appeal that in the Presbyterian system. And I must tell you that I myself grew up as a Baptist, and I was a Baptist pastor many, many years ago when I was a young man. And I came to realize that what was important was the way that the government worked. And in the congregational system, in my opinion, there was too much power given to those who were not mature or who didn't know about the issue or who hadn't studied it carefully. And so it's church government that drove me to Presbyterianism. And while there certainly are problems in Presbyterianism, without question, there are many problems, but I think it's the best form of church government that we have today. And so the church is to be ruled by elders in 1 Timothy, and there are three names for rulers in the church: elder and bishop and deacon. And most, maybe not most, but a good number of scholars, myself included, not as a scholar, but as a person who studied this, I believe that the offices of the elder and the bishop are the same office. They're not different. Then the office of a deacon is, the root word of the deacon means to serve. And so as a result of that, the deacons generally, apparently, were the people who took care of a lot of the work, like cutting the grass, seeing people at the hospital, things like that, to allow the minister of the church to be doing what he should do, studying the Scripture so that he can explain and teach the Scripture to those that are there around him. Now, Paul spends a lot of time in 1 Timothy on the qualifications for these elders. We're going to look at them quickly because he talks about them in both 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, but we'll break them down into 4 different categories that the church leader ought to have. First, there are negative descriptions of disqualifying behavior. That is, you can't be a lover of money. You can't be a person whose household is out of control, things like that. You can't be an alcoholic, those sorts of things. Then there are positive descriptions of desired behavior. You must be a person who studies the Word, a person who knows how to teach, things like that. Then there's a life situation to be expected. It's in this case where we find things like he is the husband of one wife. It's a very unusual sort of phrase, the husband of one wife, and it has created a variety of different ideas about what the phrase means. Some have said that it means one wife as opposed to 3 wives, so it's a statement against polygamy. Others have said, no, it means that the minister must be married. An unmarried minister cannot fulfill that. And others have said, no, it means that the minister should not be divorced. He should have only one wife. The Greek behind the text, the husband of one wife, essentially says he is a one-woman man. He's not given to affairs. He's not given to going after other women besides his wife. He is in love with and devoted to the woman to whom he made those godly and wonderful statements at his marriage. And then there are skills that he needs. He needs to be, as I said, apt to teach. He needs to be careful and gentle when he rebukes people, all of those sorts of things. Then Paul has to deal with false and true teaching. I'm going to go through this very quickly. We don't know exactly what the error was that was being spoken about. Some view that the opponents, it depends upon, who the enemies were depends upon your historical view of the text. If Paul wrote the text, then that's going to affect it. A second problem is determining that the opponents in the pastoral epistles that Paul does his arguments against, he sometimes does this by picking up their themes and entering into the theological debate with them. And so sometimes it's difficult to tell whether Paul is picking up their themes and arguing with them or whether this is something that Paul himself means. We don't know exactly what these people were teaching, but it had to do with the mystery of godliness, which is spoken of in 3:16. In 1 Timothy 3:16, there is this, what is called the Christ hymn, and it is, without question, one of the more beautiful passages in the New Testament, where it says that Christ was manifest in the flesh. Again, Paul is speaking against those people who say that Jesus didn't really come in the flesh. There are lots and lots of things that we could talk about in terms of what this pastoral epistle has to teach us. And we'll deal with some more of them when we deal with 2 Timothy next week and think through what's going on there. But for now, I want you to realize that Paul has some wonderful things to say to us. And this is one of the most wonderful. So I want you to go away with this. First then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings, and for all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. And so the apostle here is saying that we ought to pray for one another, we ought to pray for those who are in authority over us, and we ought to pray for our political leaders. Whether we agree with them politically or not, Paul tells us we ought to pray for them. We ought to pray that they will exhibit the kind of thing that God would be proud of. So this week, as you look through 1 Timothy, I hope that you will take a half an hour and read through the book, and it will make a real difference to you, and that you will remember why the book was written and what it is that Paul is trying to get across. It's a wonderful book for you to read. It's a wonderful book that has been preserved. And next week, we'll look at the second letter that Paul wrote to Timothy, and we'll ask the question, why did Paul not put this in his first letter? Why is there a second letter? That'll be for next week. Hope that you have a wonderful week. I hope that the Lord blesses you. I hope that His Word speaks to your heart, and I hope that you have time of reading the Word of God. Thanks for watching Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School, and we will see you again next week. Thanks.